Most people who replay conversations and tell themselves the same thing, that they're just processing, reflecting, trying to understand what happened so they can do better next time. It feels like self-improvement. It feels productive. It feels like the kind of careful, self-aware thinking that thoughtful people do. And occasionally it is, but mostly it isn't. Here's what the research actually shows. Replaying conversations isn't primarily a learning mechanism. It's a threat response. And the gap between those two things is where most people spend an extraordinary amount of mental energy without ever realizing it. Here's how it works. When a social interaction produces uncertainty, when something was said that might have landed wrong, when a response came out differently than intended, when the other person's reaction was ambiguous, the brain doesn't file it away and move on. It flags it. And then it does something that feels like reflection but functions like scanning. It runs the conversation again. Looking for the moment things went wrong. Looking for what should have been said instead. Looking for evidence that the outcome was recoverable, or evidence that it wasn't. Psychologists call this post-event processing, a cognitive pattern where the mind repeatedly reviews social situations after they've ended, focusing disproportionately on perceived failures and ambiguous moments. It's most common in people with elevated social anxiety, but it appears across a much wider population than clinical anxiety research captures, because almost everyone does it. Most people just assume it means they care deeply about how they treat others. That assumption is worth examining, because post-event processing has a defining characteristic that separates it from genuine reflection. Genuine reflection reaches a conclusion and stops. It identifies what happened, extracts something useful, and releases the event. Post-event processing doesn't stop. It circles. The same moment replayed slightly differently. The same words rearranged to produce a better outcome. The same interaction examined from a new angle that reveals a new problem to examine. And here's the mechanism underneath that loop. The brain replays social events not to learn from them, but to resolve the threat they represent. Specifically, the threat of negative social evaluation, of being seen as inadequate, unkind, foolish, or unlikable. And that threat can't be resolved by thinking about it, because the event is over. The other person has already formed whatever impression they formed. No amount of mental rehearsal changes what happened. But the brain doesn't process it that way. It treats the unresolved social threat the way it treats any unresolved threat, with continued vigilance, with repeated scanning, with the exhausting circular work of trying to think its way to safety in a situation that thinking can no longer affect. And here's the part that makes this genuinely difficult to recognize. The replay feels purposeful. It feels like you're doing something, working through it, getting closer to understanding. But the understanding never quite arrives, because the loop wasn't designed to produce understanding. It was designed to manage anxiety. And anxiety doesn't resolve through analysis. It resolves through tolerance, which brings the uncomfortable question this script has been building toward. What are you actually afraid of in the conversations you keep replaying? Not the surface answer. Not, I said the wrong thing, or they might have misunderstood me. The answer underneath that. Because the conversations that loop the longest aren't the ones where something genuinely went wrong. They're the ones that touch something older. A fear of being rejected, of being seen as less than you want to be seen, of confirming something you already believe about yourself that you'd rather not examine directly. The conversation is just the most recent piece of evidence the mind is using to argue a case it's been building for years. And replaying it won't close the case. It just adds more evidence to the file. The only thing that closes it is examining what the file is actually about, not the conversation. The belief underneath it. The one the replaying is protecting you from having to look at directly. Because as long as the mind is focused on what you said 3 days ago, as long as the loop is running, the deeper question stays safely out of reach. And that might be exactly what part of you intended. If a specific conversation came to mind while reading this, one you've replayed more times than makes sense, the content of that loop is worth more of your attention than the loop itself. This channel is interested in what's underneath the patterns most people never think to question.